She's out drawing Starbucks. She's out buying a bottle from Starbucks or something, a coffee from Starbucks. Um, but you've ran into a problem. You don't know how to draw coffee. In fact, you don't know how to draw coffee, a cup of coffee at all. You've never drawn it before. And then you realize that you've never drawn many things before. You think and hark back on your many years or maybe months, maybe even days of drawing, and you realize that you've never really drawn objects before. Let's say one day you want to draw an illustration that includes a bunch of tables. Well, what kind of table are you going to draw? You realize that you've never drawn many tables before. Well, it depends on the illustration. There are certain objects that make sense given the context, given the character, and given the environment, which leads to another problem. There are so many objects in the world that it is near impossible to perfect drawing everything, which is why practice makes perfect isn't really to be followed. It's more of a subjective thing. You can never draw something perfect, which is why when people say that, you're not really meant to follow it to an extent. So, getting back to the example, you are drawing a female wearing a jacket who is going to Starbucks, and you've never drawn a coffee before, or a bottle of coffee. So you try to think back on your days of going and buying a coffee from Starbucks, and you realize that although you've seen this object hundreds of times, hypothetically hundreds of times, you can't quite remember how it looks. And that's fine. That's completely okay. In fact, we take many items for granted. There are certain objects that we use day in, day out that if we try to apply them to a drawing, we may not fully understand how they look, or, well, how they would look in a certain style. Say you want to draw a phone, but not in the way that we usually see a phone. You want to draw it from the bottom up. That means from the charging point to the face of the viewer. But you've never really looked at the charging point to an extent. Similar to a screen. We stare at our screens a lot. We know what it looks like, so we're usually more prone to drawing phones from the screen pointing towards the viewer of the piece, pointing towards us. But you want to point the viewer towards the port, the charging point of the phone, and you don't know how to draw that. Now, of course, there are people that are going to say, well, reference it, and that's a great, valid advice. That's really valid. That's a good advice. But really, the point of practicing something is so that one day you won't have to always reference images. It's not wrong to reference images. In fact, I say quite the contrary. If you don't know how something works, then why not reference it? But the point to referencing images is so that one day you won't have to reference images so much. So, how do you combat this? Well, there are a few tips and tricks that it can help. Of course, once again, practice makes everything. Of course, that means sitting down and drawing the object that you want to draw for your illustration or for the project that you're making. What this means is that you're going to have to reference images online, or you're going to have to find the object that you want to draw if you own it, or maybe you're going to have to buy the object, which, less likely and less useful, but still a viable option. What if it's an object, though, that you would normally own. Say you want to draw a mechanic, and where do mechanics work? Well, they would work at a mechanic place. Sorry, I'm not exactly prone to drawing mechanic places, so a car mechanic. They're more likely to be in a workshop like area for cars, a garage. But you want to draw a person fixing a car. Well, you want to draw them fixing the bottom of a car, and you want to draw this person with a wrench at the bottom of a car. Of course, there is no way that you are ever going to be able to reference in real life the bottom of a car. I mean, it's not a viable option, which means that you're going to have to look online. Or, well, if you're lucky, you have a friend that for some reason is able to look at the bottom of their car. Or maybe you just are lucky and you have superpowers and you're able to look at the bottom of your car. Or maybe you have a way to look at the bottom of your car. I've said that word so many times now. So what that means is that you're going to have to reference images online. And that's not always useful. Now, Google Images and Yahoo Images, or wherever you search Firefox, it doesn't really matter, are limiting because you may want to look at a certain specific thing. Now, it really depends on the car and the model. So what you're going to want to do first is hone in on what exactly you want to draw and what model you want to draw. What that means is, instead of searching up just a generic car bottom, you're going to want to look up the model of the car, to make, the year, and then the bottom of the car. This is just one example of a car. What if you want to draw a table? And, well, once again, maybe it's a classroom. Those are rooms with a lot of tables that, aren't the normal looking tables. They're more like desks, but their desks are just miniature tables, really. So you want to draw a table for a classroom. Well, what kind of table? There are normal teacher tables, or, well, desks that hold a lot of paperwork, are sometimes usually wooden. They usually have a bunch of stuff on top of it. Usually there's a computer. Or maybe you want to draw a student table that's usually a generic desk for students, where you can place stuff or paper or books inside of a little compartment at the bottom. Or, well, if you open up the table, there are some tables where you can open it up at the top. And, well, what I'm trying to get at from saying many examples of cars and tables is that you're going to have to be specific when wanting to draw certain objects. And that's another problem. There are so many objects in the world that it's sometimes hard to be specific, so sometimes we'd want to just be generic. But I advise against that, because being specific gives you more character. And that's another thing that I want to talk about. It depends on the character, the environment around them, and, well, of course, the tone of the piece that you want to draw. You have to pick between these, and sometimes they can mix, but not always. You have to pick whether the character would own this table or that table, whether they would own this chair or that chair. It depends, which is why it's so difficult to draw objects, because objects are sometimes an extension of the environments around you, or the environments around your character. And environments are dependent on the character. Well, sometimes, in certain instances, in illustrations. Usually, what I mean by this are bedrooms. Bedrooms are, to an extent, an extension of the person who owns the bedroom. All of the items that they own are usually bought by the person. Everything inside of the room is usually an extension of the person's character and personality and the things that they like. So, well, what that means is that by being generic, or by picking the easier option and being generic, you are losing a lot more character, even if you are doing it unknowingly. There are certain illustrations out there where it is very beautiful, but you get the sense that they aren't quite comfortable with drawing objects. I'm still talking about like bedroom scenes, by the way. This info doesn't always work with scenes that aren't particularly obviously about the character. Maybe they're in a fighting scene and, that isn't always about the character. It's mostly about the motion. But what I'm talking about is illustrations that are specifically about the character, and by extension, specifically about the objects. So by being generic, you lose some character in the illustration, and you don't want that, because viewers, even though they may not know how it works, they can definitely tell when an object doesn't quite fit, or, well, most of the time they can tell. What I mean by this is that if your character is messy, they wouldn't have a clean room. Or, well, depending on the character. If the character is messy, they're usually not going to have a clean bed. They're going to have clothes around the room. They're going to have a bunch of bottles. And it's just going to be generally a cluttery mess. If they're a clean character, that doesn't mean that they're not going to have stuff outside in their room. That just means that all of the stuff that they do own is clean, and, well, they may have one or two bottles about, but that room is generally well kept. What that also means is that there's going to be a higher value of objects of value to the character. So maybe there's a bookshelf, and depending on the character and how they work, really, and how their personality is, that bookshelf may be cluttered, or maybe it's kept clean and pristine. Maybe the bookshelf isn't even used for books. Maybe it's used for action figures. That can tell a lot about a character, even if you're not specifically showing the bookshelf. Maybe it's in the background, maybe to the side, but it's still telling the viewer what this character is. So that's why objects, although tedious and annoying at times, are important to draw. It's an extension of what you want to tell the viewer, of the environment, of the tone, and of the character. And by half-assing it, you are telling the viewer that you aren't exactly sure of what you're doing, and that's fine to an extent, but we always want to become better as an artist, and become better as a creator. By practicing drawing objects and environments around the objects, we tell the viewer of our art that we are trying our best to give the best representation of the art piece that we want to create. Thank you for watching. I hope this wasn't rambly. Sometimes I just repeat the words over and over again. I need to get better with that. Thank you for watching. Bye.